Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Diane Foley, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Population Affairs in the HHS Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Adolescent Development Explained, The Social Connection. This is the final webinar in a series of 3 that reviews changes that are normal and necessary in adolescence, different ways that adolescents experience these changes, and how caring adults can support healthy development. Today's webinar focuses on social development in adolescence and shares insights from 2 experts, Dr. Terrinieka Powell and Dr. Monica Longmore. The Office of Population Affairs has worked collaboratively with Drs. Philip Lee and Beth Marshall from the Center for Adolescent Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health to develop the Adolescent Development Explained as website content based on updates to the 1999 Hopkins report called The Teen Years Explained. This updated content is available on the OPA website as web content and also as a downloadable file. We're very pleased to now bring you some of that content as a webinar series that you can watch and share with your colleagues. I want you to note that these webinars are not exhaustive. There's much more content on the webinar. I want to get started with a question that many of you answered when you signed up for this webinar. What questions do you have about social relationships in adolescence? On this slide, we see some of the topics that were sent in before today's webinar. We want to thank you for participating and sharing. Our speakers are going to address some of these issues during the webinar. Please continue to ask questions using the question box so that we might address them during the Q&A session following their presentations. Now I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Terrinieka Powell, who's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and core faculty at the Johns Hopkins Center for Adolescent Health. Dr. Powell, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, my name is Terry Powell. And so first I'd like to talk a little bit about taking the social roles of adulthood. So social development does not happen on its own, right? So a lot of times we think about physical development during adolescence, which you can see and it's very easy to do. But we actually have to cultivate social development. And we, meaning important adults, are the coaches, but we're not the only coaches. So many aspects of social development are nurtured through the ways that teens interact with their peers, as friends, and through intimate dating relationships. There are a range of ways that youth can expand on their social roles. So some examples include joining a club or experimenting with a new identity. So maybe one day a person is goth, the next person they're princess, the next day they're unicorn focused, and so all these different things. But also working during this time, like teens start to become increasingly responsible and independent. And they also start to interact with their parents in different ways, and often parents and other adults. So adults often see this as conflict, whereas young people may see it as a way of just really trying to assert their independence, but also trying to understand where the boundaries are of appropriateness, and how to express their values. And of course, teens become more interested in dating relationships. And I just want to make a quick note about dating. Teen dating may look different to us as adults, right? Maybe they don't start the same, they don't end the same, they don't last the same length of time. But there are many elements in... Hello? Okay. There are many elements in any era, such as flirtation, excitement, having crushes, jealousies, heartbreaks, despair, all of those things, including sexual longing and experimentation that may happen. So just because it doesn't look the same doesn't mean there aren't some components that aren't the same, and that there aren't ways that we can help. Next slide. So there are a number of factors that can affect social development. In particular, it's important to understand that social development doesn't happen in a vacuum. Physical changes may seem like a signal that adolescents are, adults. They may look like us, right? You're like, hey, you look bigger, you must be able to do the same things that I can do. You're taller, you're hairier, you're smelly, you eat more. There's some changes in your voices. But we really need to be careful about that, because physical changes are actually one of the least reliable ways to determine what roles young people can handle. In addition, cognitive, I think we should really be thinking about their cognitive and emotional development much more, much more, much, much more as we consider the roles that they can take. So cognitively, young people are able to have more advanced reasoning skills. So this means just thinking through the possibilities, thinking through many possibilities and logically thinking them through. They have a greater ability to think abstractly and an increased ability to see multiple parts of one problem. And they're also thinking about their futures much more. Emotionally, young people are more advanced, have more advanced, it's not uncommon for them to have intense mood swings. It's also not, they become more concerned about their peers and much more self-conscious, not in the way, and not always in a bad way. Sometimes young people are, feel like they're strong and they're beautiful because they are. Adolescence is a great period. And other times they feel like they're awkward because their physical development may be a bit out of sync with their emotional development. So it's really important for us to have conversations with young people as they're experiencing these changes, so that they know, one, that they're not alone. Two, that these are common across all species. We're all going through this kind of adolescent period. And three, that they can have someone to talk to if they need to either vent or just ask questions without judgment. And I'll pass it on to my fellow speaker now.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. I'd like to welcome Dr. Monica Longmore. She's a social psychologist and professor of sociology at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Longmore?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Next slide. One of the things that happens during adolescence is obviously young people are expanding their social circles. Their friendships are evolving. But one of the other things that's happening, though, is that they could potentially be engaging in risky behavior, and it's kind of a difficult thing because on the one hand, ultimately sexual activity is going to be normative. Likely, abusing substances never will be normative. So we've got to, kids have to kind of figure this out, and there's a couple of things going on with the risky behaviors. First, there's this process of individuation. The kids are supposed to be separating from parents and making their own decisions. That's just part of healthy growing up. But as they're moving away from parents as the primary source of socialization, they're moving more toward peers. But parents and peers kind of have different goals for young people. For parents, the goal is instilling values that will help the kids have hopefully happy and healthy futures. But for young people, for peers, they don't care about that. What their goal is to have fun. And so a lot of the risky behaviors are from the perspective of the parents is really young people just trying to have fun. And again, it becomes kind of a little bit dicey because part of what the parent has to do is what sometimes it's referred to as independence given. As the kid is getting a little bit older, they have to give more opportunities to be independent. But on the other hand, you've got friends pushing the envelope, each trying to maybe outdo the other in terms of what would be considered fun or funny. We also have the issue of impulsivity that is probably more than any other time in the life course. This is a time of great impulsivity. With regard to the sexual activity, I always think about something Ralph D. Clementi once said. D. Clementi said that if you want to know if your adolescent is sexually active, ask him or her about their best friend. And he argued that if the best friend is sexually active, likely your child is too. What I would say then, given that, is what I think is kind of going to be critically important to kind of understand what's going on is stay in touch with the friends. The friends are the ones that will be the ones contacting you in the case of a crisis. Give the friends a reason to have your number and find a reason to have their number. I think this is one of the ways that we can kind of keep tabs on the risky behaviors. So, for example, if your adolescent is posting some scary stuff, perhaps something that reflects suicidal ideation or promiscuous sexual activity, it's likely your friend, the friend that might contact you. It's not likely going to be your own child. Next slide. In terms of peer pressure and positive and negative peer pressure, I wanted to give an example of what I thought was a positive peer pressure. I had a large study with a couple of my colleagues, and part of the study we have quantitative data as well as qualitative data. With the qualitative data, we interview individuals, young people. So here's a quote where a teenager is trying to, she's explaining how she's trying to help her boyfriend stay in school. And she says to him, you don't need to become a statistic. Don't get in trouble with juvie. You've got to get yourself a state ID. You got to go to school. You got to get that diploma. No matter what you think, you got to have that diploma. I just think it's better that way. I don't want you to become a statistic. So to me, that's kind of a really good example of a positive peer pressure. In terms of those healthy relationship skills, I think what young people are learning to do, which is critically important, is really that conflict resolution, whether it's conflicts with same-sex peers like your best friend or conflicts with potential romantic partners. So learning conflict resolution skills is probably some of the most important skills that are going on. In terms of some of the negative relationship skills, one of the skills that kids do learn is how to stick it to other kids, in particular by being exclusive, that leaving kids out, deliberately inviting some kids to something and not inviting someone else. And I think, again, as adults in the lives of these kids, when we see that, that's the kind of thing that we should perhaps call a kid out on and try to discourage that kind of behavior. I think the next slide is Terry. Terry, is the next slide you?
Yep.
Next slide.
I'm not.
Okay. Terry, please.
Next slide, please. I think this is still you, Monica, but I think you covered much of this.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I would say that when I think about romantic relationships, I do think of dating and romantic relationships as really the hallmark of adolescence. And this is one of those areas where parents and teens may not see eye to eye. I think about a study, again, based on the data I've collected with my friends and colleagues, where we asked the parents, what age did your teenager start dating? And parents, on average, answered age 15. But when we asked their teenagers the same question, the answer on average was age 13. So again, we want to keep in mind that what parents think and what kids think may not always be the same thing. So dating is often kids' attempts to answer the question, who am I? And given who I am, what kind of person do I want to be with? But again, we want to keep our eye on the dating, because dating often is associated with fighting with parents. It's about whom the kid is dating. It's often associated with sometimes interfering with school, and then again, the breakups can be pretty hard. And I would say, in particular for girls, the fighting with parents, the interference with grades, and the breakups are often associated with depressive symptoms. And once again, when we're looking at engaging in risky behaviors, oftentimes it is in the context of dating relationships. When we were talking about conflict resolution skills a minute ago, we want to keep in mind that kids are trying to learn this stuff. And sometimes in these dating relationships, where the conflict resolution skills are still somewhat undeveloped, violence can occur with attempts to resolve a conflict with the use of violence. And so again, that's something that we really want to keep our eyes on. In terms of some gender differences, we want to keep in mind that oftentimes girls who are early developers often end up dating earlier simply because people ask them out with the assumption that they're older or they're more mature. And there's some evidence that early dating can lead to lower self-esteem for girls. Now, conversely, for boys who are early developers, it doesn't necessarily have that same association. And part of it is that boys who develop early actually get positive affirmation for it, positive attention. They're often considered strong, mature, older, responsible, whereas girls are often assumed to be, just because of the early development, they're assumed to be sexually active, whether they are or not. And I would also say that oftentimes, based on media, in particular social media, young people can have unrealistic expectations about what romantic relationships ought to look like. Terry, I think it's your turn. Next slide.
Yes, I'm up now. So you really set it up nicely for me, Monica. There are a number of new ways to interact. I have two daughters, and so I think about my oldest daughter, who is a preteen, and all of the ways that she can interact with her friends. And so, their text messages, they're listed on the slide, and it's not uncommon for youth to have virtual friendships or admire people who they've never met in life. There's a whole set of vloggers out there who have whole YouTube channels that young people are attracted to. But I still want to make sure that we all understand that in-person communication is still important. This section is about social development, and teens will constantly be in social settings. So it's important for us to help adolescents navigate the in-person interactions and to monitor their social media use when they're not in public. A few tips I'd just like to offer to help the folks on the line. First is to help teens build their emotional vocabulary. And by doing this, we'll improve their ability to recognize and accurately label their feelings and emotions. So often, and we'd even do it as adults, like somebody's like, oh, how are you feeling? Fine, I'm fine. And really, you're not fine. So helping young people say when they're frustrated, when they're upset, when they're sad, when they're angry, like being able to distinguish those and then have a conversation about them, and it's important. And then I think we can also model healthy relationships in our own lives and point out healthy and unhealthy relationships in the media, right? So if we're all kind of attached to the media, why not use it to our advantage? If you see a situation on social media or on the news and you and your young person are watching it together, just say like, man, what do you think about that? I think it's important to always reserve judgment after the actual discussion happens. So rather than saying like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, or I can't believe she did that, say like, man, what do you think about that? And start a conversation like that. It's also important to talk about boundaries. Being a friend or boyfriend or just any kind of interaction, it doesn't mean we have to be around that person 24/7. It's important to set limits and to help both the young people we work with and the people that they interact with to be able to set their own limits and then respect the boundaries of others as well. And of course, as Monica said, definitely help young people focus on conflict resolution. Next slide, please. So again, social media, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? We've listed a few, few risks and benefits on the slide. But again, like I want us to always think about that, like most things, social media has both good and bad. So I think whenever you kind of get annoyed with it or think it's the worst thing, think about all the ways that we're now able to be connected that we were never able to be connected. And it is our job as caring adults and youth-serving adults to help young people think deeply about what they post and, again, setting up boundaries. And this is a challenge. So I, by no means, am saying this as a proud card-carrying member of the social media monitoring club, not at all. Instead, I want to be honest and say it's a hard thing to do to comprehensively monitor all the social media that a young person has, and still there are things we can do, right? There are small things. The first thing we can do is just remind teens that what they share on social media is up to them, right? They get to decide, and it doesn't have to be everything. And this goes back to talking about boundaries, just helping a young person decide like what is for public consumption and what is not, and reminding them that once something is posted or sent, it may be impossible to not control who views it, even if they believe it's private. All of the websites now have a way for folks to screenshot or be able to share or take a picture of something. So even when they think something is private, it may not be. So again, really thinking critical about what they want to post and share. Again, setting boundaries, but then also like monitoring devices. I think that parents probably have the most power in this space. For example, in my house, no one gets to have a device at the table, and all devices for children are off at 8:30. Like that's just the rule. They're all in our rooms. All children, their devices are in our rooms, and they don't get them. And that's just the way we've decided to set limits on the amount of time they spend and what they can do. And be honest about if you are following your child or planning to follow, say, hey, I'm following you on Facebook. Lots of folks are like, and then my child will create a new Instagram page. Okay, so try to follow that page. We work with a lot of schools here, and many of our administrators follow our students on their social media pages. And rather than calling them out in that public space, if you see something that concerns you, pull them to the side and say, hey, I see you posted this thing. Would you like to talk about it? Or I was really worried about it. Can we talk about it? And I think that's all for me. Next slide for Monica.
Yeah, I think when I think about how parents and caring adults can help, I think number one, to set examples of healthy relationships. And again, I'm just going to give a quote from some qualitative work I've done with my colleagues, and it's a young girl, and this is what she tells us about her mother. She says, when she gets beat up by her boyfriend, the first person she's calling is me, crying. He just beat me up, this, that, and the other. And that's my mother. I love her, and I still care for her. So I'm going to run up to her and try to comfort her. But that's my mommy. You know what I mean? But I'm getting to the point where I can't deal with it no more. It's starting to be a burden on me. I'm losing sleep over my mom. And so, again, that would be an example of not setting a healthy relationship. And so when I think about what parents and other adults can do, keep kids out of your drama. That's what I would say. In terms of monitoring and getting to know adolescents' friends and dating partners, I do think that's critically important. And that was one of the things I had mentioned a little bit earlier. Get their contact information and give them yours, because likely when they're the ones who are going to contact you when there is some kind of crisis. An example might be if you're close to your child's friends. If your child is posting something that could be potentially dangerous, you want them to let you know. And similarly, with your own child, when let your child know you're going to try not to judge. But if their friends are posting the things that are inappropriate on Instagram or something, let you know, and that you will somehow get that information to their parents. So I'm a big believer in that kind of just working with the friends. And again, you're not one of their friends, but you can use the friends to try to get some information. Trying to encourage participation in activities that participate to the extent that you can, and what your kids are interested in. If they play some kind of sport, go to that activity. If they're engaged in art or theater, try to go to those activities. And I think it's really critically important to exhibit empathetic behavior rather than. This is probably one of those times, particularly when we're talking about things that are troublesome for young people. It's not the time for yelling and screaming, although sometimes that's what you're going to want to do. But trying to be empathetic, trying to take the role of the other. What's it like to be, 15 and in this kind of world? Teaching kids how to deal with peer pressure. One of the things that you can tell your kid is they can throw you under the bus. That anytime there's something they don't want to do, use the parents. I can't go on that camping trip. My parents would kill me, or I can't go to a party in a different city. My mother would kill me for that. Nope, I can't do that. If my mother ever found out. So I'm a big believer in letting the adolescent know that if there's something that he or she doesn't want to do and feels pressured by peers to do it, just throw the parent under the bus. I would also, and again, it's to each his own, but sometimes it's okay, I think, to share some of your own experiences, if you're comfortable with that, of times when you were pressured into doing something that you preferred not to have done, or you wished you hadn't have done. And again, that's a little different for everyone. With respect to again, dating relationships, I would also emphasize once again that with both guys and gals, that don't do anything you're uncomfortable with. Next slide. When I think about tips for talking with adolescents, I think it's important to acknowledge what they have to say, like just trying to hear it, even if you don't like it. I think you have to hear it, and use the same kinds of skills that you would use with a friend. You have to listen to it, and but I also think it's important to talk about what are appropriate boundaries and what are appropriate expectations in relationships. And this is even with friendships, that it's if your child is the one paying for everything, for example, and is feeling like he or she is being financially used by friends or boyfriends or girlfriends, talk about that. Talk about expectations, that your kid's not the bank. He or she shouldn't have to pay for everything. With regard to setting online boundaries, one of the things we have to just keep in mind is that about 75% of young people are online, and they're doing all kinds of social media. But I think it's really important for safety issues to set those boundaries that do not give out personal information. Do not let people know where you live or where you go to school. And it's just and it's I understand the need for that wider social circle of friends, but it's really very, I think, for safety issues, very important to discourage online dating for adolescents. They do have access to things like Tinder and Twitter and Grindr and Hot to Hot and all these kinds of apps. But I think as the parents, you have to model that this is something where you draw the line. You think it's inappropriate for young people to do online dating. I think the next slide is Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Longmore, Dr. Powell. We really appreciate your conversation with us. And we have several questions that have come in that we would like you to take some opportunity to discuss a little bit. Dr. Longmore, you have talked a little bit about the boundaries as far as online boundaries, social media technology, and maybe if you could expand a little bit on that and how this has affected romantic relationships with adolescents. You talked about the online dating issue, and maybe you could expand on that just a little bit more and what you might suggest to parents in having conversations with their adolescents about this.
Yeah, okay. So things have really have changed. And I said about 75%. I'm wrong. I'm looking at my statistics. It's over 80% of young people are on social media. And so things like Twitter and Instagram and Tinder and Grindr, Tumblr. So it's easy to use. And so for a lot of young people, it's kind of fun, because this is way easier than trying to talk to somebody in the hallway at school or trying to talk to someone that you met at the soccer game. But what I think we have to let young people know is that that these kinds of ways of meeting people can be rather superficial. You're just sliding, going past, looking at people's faces, and looking at a little bit of what their hobbies are, and saying whether you like or dislike them. And I think the question I would ask a young person is, what do you expect in terms of a relationship that's based solely on appearance? What kind of relationship do you think that could be? And just kind of get their sense. Well, this is what I think. So, again, the meeting, the chatting online, it's normative, but I think the actual dating does take it to a different level. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. That is very helpful. I think that one of the other things that is important is to recognize that you can make your online profile look like anything you want it to be. And a lot of times it's a false or a fake online profile, and that can also be very dangerous as well. And to remind adolescents of that as we move forward. Dr. Powell, we know that adolescents, we've talked about the emotional changes and emotional development in adolescents, and they can experience feelings of isolation and loneliness at school and online. And in talking about that, could you address a little bit how a type of social experience affects their development, and how you might maybe recommend for either educators or parents to help their adolescents navigate through this?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I just want to first put a pin in the fact that it is not uncommon for youth to experience these feelings. We would all love a life free of negative feelings, but it's not necessarily possible. So the first thing I'd say is, some youth like to be alone, right? So it's always important to assess whether this loneliness or isolation is wanted or not. If it's not wanted, then we really need to take a pulse of the frequency as well as the duration, right? So if it's an infrequent occurrence, like every now and then I don't have someone to play with on the playground, or I don't have anybody to sit with at lunch, okay, maybe your best friend wasn't there. But if it's something much more frequent and prolonged, this might be something that we need to address much more fully. All in all, I think all students need at least one adult at their school, and really in their whole network, several adults. But at school, at least one adult with whom they feel like they can talk to. And I would encourage educators to ask students, the loners or not, but especially the loners, if they have a person like this in the school. And if they don't, if they do, let that person know. Say, hey, Joey said that you're their person. Just FYI, I saw him sitting alone today. Maybe just reach out to him. So let this adult know that someone has identified them. And if the young person doesn't have a person, it's worth sitting down and brainstorming people who might be good options for them to reach out to when they feel alone. And this could include a teacher, a band instructor, a coach, some administrator, school nurses. I've even seen on the news sometimes where custodians are really good people to talk to. And I think a similar strategy could be used for young people looking to expand their friendship network. So maybe a youth doesn't always want to go to adult. Maybe they just want somebody to eat with at lunch, or they don't want to be picked last for the sports team at gym. So, again, thinking about, as the adults who know these young people, thinking about ways to okay, well, what do you like? And let's find other people who like that thing too. And maybe arrange a way for them to meet that is not as public as a big lunchroom. But hey, would you guys like to come to my class during lunch or after school? I know you guys both like art. It might be a good way for you to meet somebody else. So those are the things that I would recommend.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Oh, I was also going to make a comment about the school and parents staying connected with the school. When I was driving in, I was listening to the radio, and our local school is having some cyberbully expert coming today and tomorrow, and I'm thinking, well, that's just great, but what if I can't make that tonight and I can't make it tomorrow? Why can't they have that recorded? And I was thinking, that's like a pro-social thing, a proactive thing. A parent could call the school and say, I want those presentation's recorded. I'm not available on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night. I've got other kids, but I want to hear what these experts have to say. And I thought it was interesting. Like when I was listening, no one said this would be recorded and you can access it later. So that's one thing I would suggest to people listening, that if there's something at the school, some special presentation on cyberbullying or dating or suicide prevention, and you can't make it, just insist that it be recorded, so that you can access it when you're available.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. I think that another thing that I have noticed with adolescents is if they express a concern or a feeling that they have, or that they feel like somebody doesn't like them or they don't have any friends, one of the things I notice many adults do right away is to minimize that, is to say, oh, no, you have lots of friends, and then start to name that. And what that does, I think, is just make them feel inadequate and the fact that we aren't listening to them. And so really to help to develop skills around, well, why do you say that? What is it that is making you feel this way? To really explore, as opposed to just minimizing it and trying to list all of the reasons why you don't think that is a valid feeling with them. Dr. Longmore, many times social connections that adolescents really value, adults, parents, other adults really feel like that those are unhealthy and they have great concerns about them. So you have all both mentioned there's a disconnect sometimes between what the adolescent values and what adults know from their experience or other things that is very unhealthy for them. Can you give some strategies or ideas for parents and for educators about how they might engage the adolescent in that conversation? We know from experience that just telling them not to do it is not likely to be very effective for the majority of adolescents, but how can parents and other adults navigate through that situation?
Yeah, I think let's take the friendships first. There's lots of times kids are hanging out with kids that that pick on them, that make them feel insecure, that lower their self-esteem, that bully them, and yet our kids want to hang with those people. I think one question I would ask is, so what is it that you like about Danielle, or what is it that you like about Don? Tell me about like what's the fun part about hanging out with her? But then, of course, there's the downside. What are the downsides? And so I think a lot of times by having the kid kind of figure out or articulate for him or herself what the pros and cons are, I think it helps them kind of understand. Because sometimes I don't think they know why they're hanging out with like the mean girl who makes them feel bad, or and similarly with when it comes to dating or romantic relationships, I think I would ask the same kind of question. You a lot of times when you're with so and so, you seem unhappy. What's special about this person? What makes you like him? And then what are the things that you feel a little nervous about, or what makes you cautious or maybe not trust this person? So I would be kind of trying to find out what this person is doing for the teenager. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's really helpful. Dr. Powell, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Okay. Another question has come in from our listeners. What about adolescents who have disabilities? Are there specific ways that adults can support social connections for them?
Can you be more specific about the disabilities? So intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, any disabilities?
I think that they didn't specify, but I think that probably either of those would be important, physical disabilities as well as educational or emotional disabilities as well.
Yeah, and I realized I muted myself. I did have a comment about the previous discussion. I just wanted to echo Monica's comments around asking the way we ask young people questions, but also really listening to their responses and rather than trying to just solve the problem, just listening to what they're saying so that they'll come back when they'll keep coming back to talk things through. But around disabilities, I think that there are a few strategies. One, really like understanding what the policies, if in a school setting, understanding what the policies are around students with disabilities, making sure that like holding the school's feet to the fire and making sure that there are appropriate accommodations for your child. Secondly, understanding like where your child's strengths are, right, and where they may need some help. So if like they are interested in sports, like thinking of ways like maybe they can't actually like play the sport, but are there ways for them to be the assistant coach or the water person or the team captain, the captain. So there are lots of ways for young people to be involved in sports other than playing them. And I would say that that is true for any other activity. So if there are limitations around actually participating in it, but there is an interest, figuring out other ways to be able to participate in those activities, figuring out ways for students to participate in those activities. And then I would also encourage, we talked earlier about social media, thinking about the larger network of folks who are experiencing a particular type of disability, in seeing if in your city or your town or your state there are larger organizations that are holding events or activities for children like the ones you work with or live with. That might also be an approach in thinking about ways to support the social development of children with disabilities.
That's great, thank you. I think the programs that I've seen that have been the most effective have been the ones that have been championed by parents themselves. And a lot of times it involves setting up a buddy system type of thing within the school. And it's astonishing, but young people, adolescents, really like to feel like that they are helping somebody else. And when they are asked to be a buddy or to help someone get from class to class or things like that, it gives them also a sense of importance, and it helps their self-esteem as well as helping to develop a friendship for kids that may have disabilities, a variety of things. And so maybe if that is not available in your school system, again, as you mentioned, the larger nationwide networks have a lot of really good ideas about how to get something like that set up at your school. I wanted to, as we're coming to the end, I wanted to just make one other statement and see if our speakers would like to give one last comment. I feel like that when we're talking about the social development, and particularly when it involves dating and romantic relationships, I think one of the most important things we can encourage parents or supportive adults to do is to talk with their adolescent about what their family values are, what it is that they expect, or what they would look for, what they would hope for their child. And I think that when adolescents are armed with that information, sometimes that helps them as they're making decisions moving forward. Do either of you have any comments or thoughts about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. That if you don't explicitly say what it is that you would expect, kids are not mind readers. They don't always get it, and so I think it's perfectly fine to say what you expect. I know something that I've said to my daughter. She's a little bit older now, but I've been real clear that I'm not a fan of premarital cohabitation. That as long as I'm paying for anything, there'll be no boyfriends living with her. And that's a value. And and when she was younger, similarly, I was real clear on, you can date if you want, but really, I want you home. I don't want you spending time at somebody else's house. That boy can come over here. And so I think it's, I think that's what we should be doing. Kids should know what our values are.
And I just like to comment on it and just reiterating 2 points that I made throughout the pieces that I was talking. I agree that expressing values is important. First of all, it allows us to continue in this role of being coaches along the way. Social development, unlike physical development, has to be cultivated. So if there aren't important people in young people's lives to help them figure out, learn the ropes and figure out how to navigate through this time, they will find other people to help them. So being able to express one's values is important and a way to continue to help cultivate that process. And then the other thing is talking about values and expressing them from the adults also gives young people the opportunity to talk about how they feel about those values, right? So I can't stress enough how important it is to listen to what young people are saying. So maybe it's okay if you disagree with my values. We need to figure out what that means, though. So if for example, Monica said, if that means I'm not a fan of you living with your partner, then that means you may have to pay on your own. Really thinking through the consequences of having disagreements or having different values. But it's always important to listen to what young people have to say about these same topics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell, Dr. Longmore, for joining us. That brings our webinar to a conclusion. You will, if you check back on the website, recordings and the slides from this presentation will be available for you. And again, we thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank
you. Thank you. Good afternoon.